Welcome back to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic. It's Build a Deck Tuesday, and in today's video we are going to show off what the community selected as the signature spell for our 4th Oathbreaker deck, and we will also start to fill the 58. Hello and what's up, MTG BC, baby? That is the MTG Burgeoning community. Welcome back to another Oathbreaker deck building series. The community selected as its 4th Oathbreaker by majority vote, Huatli, the Sun's Heart. And also during the last video, the MTG Burgeoning community was tasked with the chore of selecting Huatli's signature spell. And again, by a majority count of votes, Huatli's signature spell will be Tower Defense. It's an instant for 1 and a green that gives creatures we control +0/+5 and reach until end of turn. Although the reach is valuable for defensive purposes, it's that +0/+5 for only 2 mana at instant speed that's going to interest us the most, because Huatli reads that each creature we control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Alright, so we have our 4th Oathbreaker. We have our Oathbreaker's signature spell. If you missed any of the previous Oathbreaker deck building videos, you can click the links in the description below and review them. So let's begin to fill the 58. Today we are going to fill the deck, well, with its proportionate number of non-creature spells. So we're going to have our removal, we're going to have some ramp, we're going to have some ways in which to win the game, and a few other surprises along the way. Let's get started with some of the best ramp spells. I'm sorry, let's say it again. Let's start with some of the best removal spells our colors have to offer. We're in white. We got a Swords to Plowshares. That's really, that's removal spell 1A. Only because removal spell 1B is Path to Exile. Each spell is 1 white mana at instant speed, and we exile target creature. It doesn't get much better than that. Our opponent either gets to gain life equal to the creature's power if it's swords, or that our opponent gets to search their library for a basic land and put it into play tap if the creature is Path. Next up, we have a Beast Within. Instant speed, of course, mana value of 3, destroy target permanent. And for the purposes of this format, we might as well just replace permanent with Planeswalker, because we are going to make sure that we have our deck filled with removal for Planeswalkers, as well as some other choice removal spells. So Beast Within and Beast Within 2.0, because we've got white too. There's our generous gift. Does exactly what Beast Within does, except it's 2 and a white versus 2 and a green, and it leaves behind an elephant instead of a beast. So those are first 4 removal spells. Removal spell number 5, Banishing Light. This is still a mana value of 3, comes down as an enchantment, and will exile a non-land permanent an opponent controls until Banishing Light leaves the battlefield. Now, I like that this is included in the deck because this can target another player's Oathbreaker. We can get rid of the Planeswalker that they're controlling. Most likely, they will just return it to the command zone. They won't allow it to be put underneath Banishing Light, I would assume. That's usually how it goes in games that I've played. So by, banishing light someone's Oathbreaker, not only do we put the Oathbreaker in the command zone, but we also nullify the ability of them using their signature spell. Of course, because this is Oathbreaker, you can't cast your signature spell unless you have your Oathbreaker on the battlefield and under your control. So the last 3 removal spells, spot removal spells, are included to make sure that our opponents have difficulty doing just that. So now let's move forward with a couple of other removal spells. Staying with the spot removal spell, we're going to include a copy of Return to Dust. Now, this is not just a permanent, this is just going to be enchantments or artifacts, but it is important to include some form of exiling because sometimes, as we've seen recently with other formats, indestructibility can be quite a problem. So at 2 and 2 white, white at instant speed, we're exiling an artifact or an enchantment. And if we cast a spell during one of our main phases, well, we're going to do it again. Return to Dust is going in. All right, next up, we're having a couple of board wipes. And these board wipes are going to be slanted in our favor because, let's be honest, we're working with a very unique paradigm here because of the dynamic that Huatli presents with us by allowing our creatures to assign combat damage based on their toughness. So when next we meet and we fill the rest of our deck with our lands and our big bootied creatures, we want to include some, mass removal spells that are, let's say, slanted in favor of us. So the first one is going to be Slaughter the Strong. At 1 and 2 white at sorcery speed, each player chooses any number of creatures they control with total power 4 or less, then sacrifices all other creatures they control. For the purposes of our deck, the creatures that we have are going to have very small powers if they have power at all. We will not be able to say the same for most of our other opponents when we sit down at an Oathbreaker table. So Slaughter the Strong slants favorably towards us with respect to mass removal. Another mass removal spell that will slant favorably toward us that was actually included as one of the signature spell options for the community to decide, that is Fell the Mighty. Destroy all creatures with power greater than target creature's power. So we can target one of our creatures with power 0 or 1, and well, if we have a 1, we're not going to target the 0, of course. We target the 1 and then hopefully wipe the board of everyone else. Fell the Mighty is going to be a sneaky inclusion, and it's definitely going to help our deck from a mass removal standpoint because most of our creatures are still going to remain in play. And that's going to do it for our removal spells. Now, let's move into a couple of ramp spells. We're not going to include too much spell ramp because, well, honestly, when we get back together to continue this series, we're going to have a number of creatures that are going to be included that are going to help provide ramp for us and also fit the criteria that Huatli is looking for. So because we're in green, we're going to include both of them. And of course, preferential treatment for number 1 goes to Kodama's Reach because it was created first. 1 Kodama's Reach and 1 Cultivate. Mana value is exactly the same. We can search our library for 2 basics, 1 onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into our hand. 2 copies, those are our 2 ramp spells. Now the rest of the deck, aside from one last spell that we'll talk about at the very end, the rest of our deck is going to be geared around our win condition. And our win condition is what Huatli gives us. Huatli is allowing our big-bootied creatures to go into combat and assign their combat damage based on their toughness. And the signature spell of +0, +5, well, that's going to work out very well on our behalf too. Can you imagine if we're under a scenario because tower defense only costs 1 and a green? It's very reasonable to think that we can cast that twice in the same turn for a total of 6 mana, giving our creatures +0, +10. So let's start reviewing some of the spells that we're including in this deck to help with that win condition. The first one is Primal Rage. It's an enchantment all the way back to the time of Exodus. No, I'm sorry, Stronghold. Wait, what is... No, that cell is Stronghold. My mistake. This is the set right after Tempest. So this is an enchantment, 1 and a green. Very simply, all creatures we control gain trample. Because although our creatures that are going to have them big booties is going to swing in for combat, they could still get chump block for days if they're playing up against a token deck or any kind of... goblins or elves or anything like that. We want to make sure that we can get through with some damage, and giving all of our creatures trample will allow us just to do that. So Primal Rage all the way back from Stronghold. Next inclusion, we're staying with an enchantment with a mana value of 1 and a green, and that's going to be Assault Formation. This is going to help us continue with our win condition even if Huatli is in the command zone and we're unable to cast her. Assault Formation is an enchantment that reads, each creature we control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Sounds pretty familiar because that's exactly word for word what Huatli does for us with her static ability. This enchantment also says tap a green and target creature with Defender can attack this turn as long as it didn't have Defender. Now I'm going to stop the train right here. We are not going to include any creatures with Defender in this deck. We don't have a great number of ways to turn off Defender, this being the only one included in the deck. So it may be a bad idea to include a bunch of creatures with Defender when we only have one way to get them to actually attack and participate in our win condition. So don't expect to see creatures with Defender joining in this deck when the deck building series continues in the future. And the last ability for Assault Formation, 2 and a green, creatures we control get +0/+1 until end of turn. So not exactly what Tower Defense does, but it does give us a mana sink for mid to late game combat chicanery. All right. Oh no. Next up, we are going to visit a signature spell that did not make the cut, but is definitely going to be included, and that's Unbreakable Formation. 2 and a white at instant speed. Creatures we control gain Indestructible. Plus, if we cast this during our main phase, most likely our pre-combat main phase, we can put a +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures, and they gain Vigilance. This is the ultimate let's wipe out an opponent's spell. We cast this during our pre-combat main phase. We make all of our dudes indestructible and vigilant, giving them +1/+1 counters. We can send them all off into combat knowing they can't be destroyed, plus they have vigilance, so they'll be around to block on the inevitable backswing from either that opponent if we didn't wipe them out, or one of the other opponents at the table. So Unbreakable Formation, we can actually we can consider Unbreakable Formation to be one of our mini win conditions wrapped into our main win condition of Huatli and Tower Defense. All right, next spell to include in this deck, Collected Company. 3 and a green at instant speed. We look at the top 6 cards of our library, and we put 2 creature cards with a converted mana cost of 3 or less from them onto the battlefield, and it will be an insistent part of the finishing off this deck that the majority, if not all of the creatures included, are going to have a mana value of 3 or less. So end of turn Collected Company, get a couple of creatures into play, and hopefully we have enough to swing with those creatures and maybe knock someone out with a surprise. Next spell to be included, also one of the signature spell options for the community to decide. It was my personal favorite, but it did not make the cut. However, it's going in the 58, and that's Akroma's Will. 3 and a white at instant speed. We get to choose one of the following 2 walls of text. However, if we have Huatli in play and under our control, we can choose both of them. Either our creatures are getting Flying, Vigilance, and Double Strike, or they're getting Lifelink, Indestruction, and Protection from all colors until end of turn. If we are fortunate enough to have Huatli in play and a big enough army, this is a win condition card because we cast this and all of our creatures are going to gain Flying, Vigilance, Double Strike, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Protection from all colors. It boggles my mind that this card is not more valuable. I don't understand it. Akroma's Will is a win condition in any deck that's sporting creatures. I don't get why this card is not more valuable. And until the community catches on, I'm fine with that because that just allows me to continue to stockpile these babies because I love this card. Win condition, Akroma's Memorial. Speaking of win condition, yeah, we're going to bend it a little bit here. We're going to be a little degenerate with this next card. I mean, we're in Selesnya colors at an Oathbreaker table, so we're going to need to put a little extra oomph into the spells. I mean, we are dealing with a very small niche of what we can do with our combat interactions, so we want to make those combats as bang for their buck as possible. So, enter Triumph of the Hordes. Sorcery speed 2 and double green that reads until end of turn. Creatures we control get +1/+1 and gain trample, and they gain infect. Yes, that's right. We're going to give our army infect, and we're going to swing in for infect damage. Now, I will point out, this shouldn't be as salty as it would be if this were going into an EDH deck. We're starting off with 40 life in EDH, so Infect you only have to send in 10 points of Infect damage. I can understand to a degree of saltiness that would cause. However, in Oathbreaker, much like Standard, much like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, you're starting with a life total of 20, so to send in 10 Infect, that's not that big of a deal. But we're still going to do it because we can. Triumph of the Hordes is another one of our win conditions that will interact very favorably with Huatli and or Tower Defense. All right, our last win condition card is going to be old school, and I do mean old school, originally printed in Tempest, although I don't have a Tempest copy available. We're going Overrun, baby. 2 and triple green, old school, +3/+3 and trample for all of our creatures. Another win condition added to a deck that is now combat ready outside of the creatures. One last non-creature spell to include. It does not necessarily fit into the categories of ramp. It does not necessarily fit into the category of removal. And it does not necessarily fit into the category of win condition or battle enhancement. However, I believe that this card could offer our deck a great deal of versatility depending on the actual game itself. And that's going to be a card from Shadowmoor, and it's going to be called Wheel of Sun and Moon. For any 2 Selesnya mana, it's an enchant player aura. And it reads, if a card would be put into enchanted player's graveyard from anywhere, instead that card is revealed and put on the bottom of that player's library instead. Why I want to include this card is for a couple of different reasons. I noted its versatility when I was describing it before finally spoiling what it was. And why I think it's such a good card is that if there is somebody at the Oathbreaker table who was using a graveyard synergistic deck or trying to pull off some kind of graveyard shenanigans to control and dominate the table, a Wheel of Sun and Moon pretty much puts an end to that. Just by enchanting that player, they're not going to be able to access their graveyard because any cards that go into them from anywhere are just going to get put back on the bottom of their library. Now, if we're sitting down at a table and this is in our hand and we do not have a player that's using any kind of graveyard archetype for their deck, well, then we enchant ourselves and any of our cards that end up going to the graveyard. And trust me, there will be many, most likely because of our creatures are going to be targeted with reckless abandon. Then we get the opportunities of just having those cards going right back into our library. So Wheel of Sun and Moon can help stop an opponent's graveyard-themed deck, or it can help us extend what we have in our deck and draw the mid to late game even longer if we need to do so. So I'm interested to see how that card interacts at the Oathbreaker table. And there it is, MTG BC. Your number 4 Oathbreaker has been selected alongside her signature spell. And here we have included our non-creature spells. When next we return, we will install our land base as well as our creatures. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.